This is the Regained Wellness Podcast with Jamie Logie, Episode 5, Everything You Wanted to Know About Gluten, but Were Too Afraid to Ask. Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Jamie Logie. Just want to thank you for joining me today and listening. If you haven't already, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Leave me a review, rating, just helps get the word out on the podcast, helps spread it. Hopefully more people can check in and pick up all the information I'm trying to share here. I run the website called regainedwellness.com, same as the podcast name. And the point of the website is to help you take back your health with arming you with relevant information on nutrition topics, specific diet information, things you should be including in your diet, things you should be avoiding, benefits of fitness, what exercises are good, why you should be doing it. I try to cover everything that's kind of encapsulated in wellness and everything I can do to help provide relevant and beneficial fitness and nutrition information is the whole idea behind all this, the website, the podcast. I just want to share what I know and try and help people the best I can. And that leads into today's topic, which is the big old nasty gluten issue. And you might be sick of hearing about this already. It's everywhere you look. People are always talking about it. You probably know someone who's gluten-free. You might be doing it yourself. You might not even be sure why you're doing it. You know to stay away from gluten. So the whole point of today's show is to get an understanding of what this whole thing is, why it can be a problem, why you should avoid it, and just to get you up to speed with some of the science and the knowledge behind it. The first thing I'd have to recommend right off the bat, which is a source of a lot of the information, is the phenomenal book called Wheat Belly by Dr. William Davis, and I'll put a link to that book in the show notes. And it's pretty phenomenal, and it's kind of the authority on all things to do with gluten, specifically wheat. And Dr. Davis is an actual cardiologist and had been wondering about removing gluten from his patients' diets to see what would happen. And over the course of hundreds and hundreds of studies and just feedback on his patients, he started to see a lot of common things come up that could be traced back to the wheat issue and the gluten issue. And that's what we're going to look into here today. So you might find yourself with things like bad skin, joint pain, brain fog, digestion problems, maybe cramps and bloating, and you might need to look at what makes up a majority of your diet. If it was like me way back, it would include, some form of cereal and toast at breakfast. Lunch would be obviously like sandwiches of some sort, 2, 3 at a time. Dinner or, even afternoon snacks would be anything from chips, snacks, food, pretzels, what have you. Dinner for a lot of people can be centered around pasta a lot of the times. I would add in a lot of things to these meals though, because I had specific sporting and fitness goals, but there was one constant that would run through all of them, and that was wheat, and specifically gluten. And like the average person, that probably is making up a cornerstone of their diet. And essentially 50% of the calories consumed worldwide now come from grains. And today, basically 17 plants provide 90% of the food supply for mankind. And going along with this, according to the United Nations, wheat itself is making up 20% of the calories consumed by humans. So I think it's just important to look at this whole issue and actually, what is gluten? What is it found in? Should you be avoiding it? What makes it so detrimental? So let's look at what it is. Put simply, gluten is a protein that's found in the seeds of grass, and we call these seeds grains. And there are many different types of grains. There's the big three would be wheat, barley, and rye. But we're going to look mostly at wheat as it dominates the consumed grain categories and might be responsible for an onslaught of issues that we're facing today. Gluten is, singled out as this lone substance, but if you look at it, we're really talking about wheat, because that's making up a lot of majority of our food: breads, pastas, cake, snack foods, or what have you. And to define it simply, gluten is it's a sticky protein which is found in these grains, and actually comes from the Latin word which means glue. And this gives an elasticity and a chewiness to things like breads and dough. And obviously this is going to be helpful for making things like pizza, and it's important in baking, and for doughs, it just gives it that texture. And if you remember the paleo episode we did, we were talking about how the Paleolithic era ended when the age of agriculture started, which is roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, and that's when the origins of wheat start. And the end of the Ice Age, when the glaciers sort of retreated, they left behind grasses that were able to spread and easily multiply, and this original grass was called einkorn. And einkorn was a simple form of wheat that contained just 14 chromosomes. Then this einkorn would evolve into emmer wheat, which is the wheat of the Bible. And a lot of the issues that come up today is people say, we've been eating wheat for thousands of years. How can it have started all these problems now recently in the last few decades? But just what we're wanting to point out here, that the wheat of today is completely different than the wheat of 100 years ago even, and especially these ancient wheats, and especially, say, the wheat of the Bible. And wheat and bread, though, have a strong tie to early Christianity, with bread and being known as the staff of life, and the practice of breaking bread and its use in communion and everything like that. So this emmer wheat is now a 28 chromosome species. So it's starting to evolve a little bit, and would last quite a while to the Middle Ages, where triticum became the dominant form of wheat. We're going to fast forward now into the 1960s, and this was a time when the Earth started to experience a huge boom in population, and the concerns were growing around the amount of food available, and this was becoming a pressing issue. How are we going to feed this ever-growing world? And a solution started to emerge from the newer growing field of genetics. And one of the main men behind this was a guy named Dr. Norman Borlaug, who was an American biologist. And he was an individual who was able to create a high-yield version of wheat called the semi-dwarf variant. So it's a shorter, stockier plant. If you look back at old pictures, with the idea of amber waves of grain and these tall, fields of wheat. If you look back to old pictures, from the 30s and 40s and 50s, you'd find these taller fields. If you look at fields of wheat today, they're actually quite a bit smaller than you would think. And the idea with this semi-dwarf variant of wheat was that it can improve wheat yield over tenfold in a single acre. So today, virtually all the wheat available to us is this high-yield, semi-dwarf version of the wheat. And it needs to be recognized that any of these changes that happened were done out of noble intentions. And like I said, with the smaller form of this wheat that was roughly 2.5 feet high, the stalks of the plant had to be engineered thicker than natural to be able to hold up the heavy stalk head that was on top of it. And because of this improved yield in every acre, it's understandable that all farmers were wanting a piece of it. So a regular farmer who was growing, say, 8 bushels an acre was now looking across, seeing his neighboring farm growing 80 bushels an acre. So of course he'd want to get on board with this. And in such a sink or swim business like farming, the ability to compete and produce is so important. And again, during this whole time, as this new form of wheat emerged, there was never really research done into if it was safe for human consumption. But as we're saying, what is this new form of wheat and what changed in it from the wheat of, our ancestors or even our grandparents or great-grandparents? In developing this new form of wheat, there was some new scientific techniques that had to be used. Terms like repeated selective hybridizations, back crossing, induced mutations, kind of a new Frankenstein of a plant was basically created and was unable to survive without chemical support. Basically genetically stitched together with parts from various sources. And we look today at the issue with GMOs, or genetically modified foods, and they're a growing concern, and rightfully so, but you have to almost look at these GMOs as a vastly superior creation compared to these earlier techniques, due to the fact they could not control all the mutations that would happen or would occur in the plant. And as we're stating, them before, the development of this modern wheat was done with noble intentions, but was this safe during the whole process? Was this new creation of ours going to be okay for human consumption? And I think because what was produced still resembled something in nature, I think it was just assumed that it was going to be treated by the human body as such. Like these new engineered plants didn't now look purple, or they didn't have weird growths on them. It looked, it looked similar to what they had before. So it was maybe just understood that the body was going to recognize it as such. But in truth, what had been engineered was virtually unrecognized by the body. So when we're referring to gluten, what does all this science have to do with gluten itself? And since it was now observed that we could control what traits wheat could have, this modern wheat, we're talking about the 14 chromosomes from einkorn and the 28 chromosomes from emmer wheat. The modern wheat now contained 42 chromosomes, and it contained something called the D genome. So this allowed for higher concentrations of gluten within the wheat, which lent itself well to baking, especially at high temperatures, and provided what they call viscoelasticity, which is very key for pizza dough. It's got that stretch. So you've obviously seen everyone tossing pizza dough over their head. It helped keep that elasticity in the dough, which is very important. If you look around today, you might be observing, obviously, all these new people who are going gluten-free, and there's gluten-free products everywhere you look. I saw ice cream that said gluten-free on it. I saw hot dogs that said gluten-free. It's a great sales marketing asset now for companies to be able to slap gluten-free onto something, because people are going to take that over something that might contain gluten, even though they're not sure exactly what gluten will be. And we'll talk a little bit more about the gluten-free alternatives and if they are any better or if they're worse in a minute. So the big two issues that surround gluten are the idea of gluten sensitivity and gluten intolerance. And these are two different things. Gluten sensitivity can cause issues with digesting, cramping, bloating, nausea, diarrhea, things like that. They can be mild or they can be quite uncomfortable. But obviously it's hard to tell someone who has intense cramping that it's just a mild occurrence. Gluten intolerance, however, is known as celiac disease. And this is a full-on condition where the consumption of gluten causes the above problems, but more magnified. And if you know anyone with celiac disease, you know that after accidental consumption, they are completely out of commission for quite a while. One of my best friends has, actually two of them have celiac disease, and just the slightest amount, and they are just knocked out. And it's an absolute mess. Like, it's a serious, serious condition. How did gluten cause this complete intolerance and sensitivity, you might be thinking? So the majority of absorption of the food we eat happens in the small intestine. And inside the small intestine, you have a bunch of finger-like projections, if you will, that are called villi and microvilli. And this is where specific nutrients and amino acids are absorbed. Then they're passed through to the bloodstream. So a good example I've heard used is that these fingers, these like finger-like projections, are like shag carpet. They're like the shags on a shag carpet, like the orange shag carpet I grew up with wood paneling on the walls. And what happens with gluten is that over time, the gluten breaks down these shags until it's left as basically like a flat subfloor. And without these shags in place, absorption becomes a very painful and potentially dangerous situation. And it's not the same in everyone, but a person who is gluten intolerant can be looking at some of these following issues, such as anemia, usually because of iron deficiency, loss of bone density, which is osteoporosis, or bone softening. There's itchy, blistering skin rash. There's headaches and fatigue. There's nervous system injury, which can include numbness, tingling in the feet and hands, possible problems with balance. There's joint pain. There's reduced functioning of the spleen. There's acid reflux and heartburn. And this kind of comes back to, everyone always says you are what you eat. You are more essentially what you absorb. And with wheat, absorption becomes an issue. The problem is everyone has always been told to eat more whole grains. And the problem with whole grains, as I'm air quoting right here, is that they're not exactly whole grains. Like if you're eating breads or you're eating a form of pulverized ground flour. And they also can contain the husk of the grain, which contains compounds that can block the absorption of nutrients. The problem is when whole grains take up too large a percentage of the diet, the problems start happening. And one of these key problems is that even though there can be some good amount of minerals in some of these grains or whole wheats, the availability of having these minerals absorbed is low because they're bound by phytic acids. And some of these minerals can end up just being passed right through you. There's an interesting study here in 1942 in Dublin, in Ireland. The emergence of rickets started to rise sharply when there was a mass changeover from the use of refined white flour to whole wheat flour. And rickets is usually caused by vitamin D deficiency, but also from a mineral deficiency with calcium as the most important mineral. So even if someone has a good level of vitamin D, they still can become deficient from calcium because of rickets. So the diets they had contained quite a lot of minerals, but the interference of the whole wheat was not allowing for the absorption of them. And there's interesting, I was talking about William Davis as one of the big gurus on the wheat gluten issue. There's also a really top-notch researcher called Dr. Stephen Guyanet, who's a PhD from the University of Washington. And it's his opinion that we're not yet well adapted as a species to consume a diet that's primarily made up of grains without facing some real health consequences. And he goes on to say if we had another million or so years of grain-heavy diets, we might be able to handle them a little more effectively. So that timeline might pose a little bit of a problem. And another problem is the problem with inflammation. And there are foods that can cause inflammation in your body, and they can lead to what is called autoimmune disease. The problem with gluten is it can break through the intestinal lining where it ends up being attacked by the immune system. It's like a foreign invader busting through the wall. And we sometimes think of the immune system when we speak of the immune system like it's one thing, like it's like a an organ, like a singular large organ or something, but it's essentially a series of cells, and 80% of the cells that help make up the immune system reside behind the large intestine. So when a foreign substance like the protein gluten gets through, it's attacked and recognized as a threat. The problem is the body starts recognizing its own tissue as the same substance, and essentially the body turns on itself, and this is what autoimmune disease is. And this can cause some big diseases, including obviously celiac disease, diabetes, Hashimoto. This is a disease that causes a thyroid to not make enough thyroid hormone, multiple sclerosis, and rheumatoid arthritis actually as well. The issue as well with the wheat is the idea is it actually addictive. Like I was saying before, people, myself included, you wake up and you have cereal for breakfast. A couple hours later, you're feeling hungry. You might feel even a little lightheaded. That's people, mid-morning snacks tend to be things like donuts, pastries. At lunch, you're having sandwiches again, pizza if you're in a rush. A couple hours later, you feel like your energy has dropped. You might feel foggy. You need, there's that afternoon slump, they say. You need something else to eat. By dinner, you're starving. You need a large plate of spaghetti or pasta. You still might not even feel satisfied after that. This situation is really can be a nasty combination of the way wheat can cause spikes in blood sugar on its own and addictive qualities. When we look at gluten, it's important to know that gluten is made up of two compounds. It's actually a doubly jointed thing that's made of glutenin and gliadin. And it's gliadin that's potentially causing a lot of these issues with the addiction. Gliadin has been seen to be an appetite stimulant due to the high amounts of gluten now that is in your bread, your cereal, your pasta. There's higher quantities than ever before. And the gliadin acts as an opiate by binding to the opiate receptors in your brain. So it's not causing the same high as like a heroin or a cocaine or a hard drug, but still does produce a bit of a high. There's kind of this warm, fuzzy feeling that comes after eating high carbohydrate meals, which tend to be, wheats, breads, pastas, and whatnot. And I think it's also maybe the reason when you're stressed out, you turn to comfort foods. Again, which are those type things like macaroni and cheese and cakes and heavily dense, calorie-filled, gluten, wheat-filled type meals. It's just something we turn to. These things tend to be pizza's another one now that I'm thinking of it. That's always a huge go-to for comfort food. And when we're turning these comfort foods, could it be that we're requiring kind of a hit, like to get that fix to satisfy those opiate receptors on the brain? It's an interesting look at individuals who've overdosed on heroin. They have a drug called naloxone, which, when administered, takes away the high the user is experiencing. And wheat appears to have the same withdrawal effect as people who seem to crave breads and stuff like that and so on when they have not had it in a while. The same drug naloxone has been shown to reduce the cravings of wheat in the individuals to whom it was administered. And they found that they were, on average, were eating 440 calories less a day. And when we talk about addictive compounds and blood sugar spikes, another thing you need to be aware of in wheat is a substance called amylopectin A. And this is what causes wheat to be absorbed rapidly and can cause a spike in blood sugar. The amylopectin A reacts very quickly to our own salivary amylase, which is in the mouth, causing that rapid rise in blood sugars. Like even just putting a piece of bread in your mouth can raise the blood sugar because of this amylopectin A. So the higher, obviously, your blood sugar goes, the farther the drop that follows. And that's why it's recognized that eating wheat can cause this perpetual 90 to 120 minute cycle of hunger, as we kind of illustrated above with the breakfast and then being hungry 2 hours later and the snacking. And it's kind of all related to this up and down blood sugar levels, and that are also related to brain fog and just lack of focus through all the day. Another obvious issue that comes from all the consumption of all this wheat and everything is added weight. And with the constant intake of wheat, regardless if it's white bread, brown bread, whole grains, whatever, blood sugar is affected on a daily basis. Insulin, which has to be secreted constantly to clear this, is now converted sugar out of the blood. It starts not to be used efficiently, and the pancreas can burn out, and this can lead to type 2 diabetes. And if you think insulin's main job is producing the fat, this fat-storing hormone, and when the glucose in the blood is not needed for energy or activity, it is stored in the form of body fat by insulin, and it appears that this fat is stored, seems to be stored primarily around the midsection as this visceral fat, and some people call it a wheat belly, or, a beer belly. You can picture what I'm referring to. With all this gluten that's around us and this highly refined wheat, what are some alternatives to gluten? Like I was saying before, a lot of manufacturers have jumped on the gluten-free bandwagon, and having the distinction of being gluten-free is a probably good marketing campaign at the moment. The issue, besides, there's some of these, like I said, I saw a carton of eggs labeled gluten-free the other day, which is just absurd. There are the gluten-free alternatives that are, still snack treats like cakes, cookies, and whatnot. And here's the issue with the gluten-free products. Without gluten, there's got to be some form of flour or whatever to replace it. So some of these products are using things like potato starch. You'll see cornstarch. You'll see tapioca starch. So yeah, none of these ingredients contain gluten, but they're still incredibly high on the glycemic index and really can send your blood sugar level soaring even higher than gluten itself. I would say to use these products moderately. If you have a real gluten sensitivity, if you have real gluten intolerance, yeah, you're not going to get the problems with these because obviously they're gluten-free. I mentioned before, I work at a kids summer camp in the States in northern Connecticut, and there's a lot of kids there. There's almost 500. So of course you're going to come across some real food issues and food allergies, and there are a bunch of kids that are diagnosed celiac and they have to have some gluten-free products. So they have found some good options, and you can make a lot of these products quite recognizable, like their counterparts of cupcakes, cookies, brownies. They can be pretty close because they're using some of these other flours that are quite sweet, but the trade-off is they can really play havoc with your blood sugar levels. There are some good alternative choices, especially for like home baking. There's things like almond flour you can use. There's coconut flour. There's flaxseed meal. These, even though they're a refined ground product, they're going to be lower on that glycemic index and even have some protein along with them and some beneficial nutrients. Almond flour looks like a pretty good choice. My sister uses it quite a bit to make, some things like brownies, and sometimes it's honestly, you wouldn't know it's not from actual wheat flour. Again, it's the same thing. You want to use these things as an occasional treat because you're still, consuming something that's processed in a flour, but looks to be far, far better choice than the commercial gluten-free products. To me, gluten-free can be healthy as long as it's the right kind of gluten-free. Obviously, there's a lot of issues here, and gluten's a really hot topic, and it'll be for a little while. But, like I was just saying, before you go diving into all those gluten-free products, you might want to just take a second, check out all the ingredients in them. You might be avoiding gluten, but you might be substituting in some other things that are causing a lot of other issues as well. This is something I recommend to some people and seems to have some positive benefits, but taking 5 to 7 days, say, and trying to cut wheat out of your diet just to get an idea of what doing that can maybe potentially help your health and your wellness is worth trying. If you eat it constantly, you might feel some of those withdrawal symptoms we were talking about before, like the headaches and whatnot. But I really believe eliminating this modern wheat, especially in the form of breads, white pastas, cakes, stuff like that, is really, you're really not missing anything if you eliminate these products. You're really only going to be doing good things by avoiding these processed, refined, pulverized, ground flours that add in a whole bunch of other stuff as well. That, they'd be bad enough on their own, but obviously, say a cake, you're looking at a onslaught of chemical additives along with just the gluten and everything that's in it. You can see those, 12 grain breads or ancient grain breads on the shelves, but it's the same thing. You're not eating whole grains when you're eating a bread. You're eating a pulverized processed flour that's probably come from a genetically modified, unnatural form of wheat. It's wheat and bread. They've always been a part of our human history, but in the last 50, 60 years, we've really seen an explosion in the rates of gluten sensitivity and celiac disease. There's a website called celiac.com, and they deal with celiac disease and gluten intolerance research. And they're showing an increase of 400% in the cases of celiac disease in these last 50 to 60 years. And now 1 in 133 people have celiac disease. The problem is that celiac disease is something that can take 20 to 30 years to become apparent. And I think it's fair to point out, I don't think our bodies have changed that much over the years, but our foods definitely have. And we're exposed to a lot of brand new things that resemble foods and really aren't. And we've been kind of bombarded with all these new creations and these new genetically modified and altered products. And it's, I think, becoming apparent that these things are causing some real issues. So I'm not sure where you stand still on the whole gluten issue. Hopefully this is starting to give you some information and you can start looking into it further. And like I said, there's no such thing as an essential bread. There's not an essential pasta. It's not something you need in your diet. Like, to cut these things out, you're not going to be missing out on anything. One of the best tips I can say is replace grains with greens. Now you're getting something more beneficial to your body. You really don't need to be eating bread specifically. So if you find yourself with any of those, things we were talking about before, and digestion problems, cramping, joint problems, brain fog, give it a shot. Cut the gluten and the wheat out for 5 to 7 days, maybe even longer. See how you do. You might find yourself feeling better. You have really nothing to lose from it. So just want to thank you for listening today. I appreciate everybody who takes the time to listen to everything I'm having to say. And like I said, if you could go ahead and subscribe on iTunes, leave me a rating, leave me a review, that would really help. You can check in at regainedwellness.com. You can see everything that's going on there. new blog posts, everything like that. If you want to connect with me, I like to hear from anyone whenever I can and help you out however I can as well. You can get a hold of me by email. That's info@regainedwellness.com. You can check me on Facebook. That's facebook.com/regainedwellness. And on Twitter, which the handle is @regainedwellness. So hope to hear from you sometime soon, and we'll see you on the next episode. See ya.